Good afternoon and welcome to the HKGFA event on greenwashing, risk, regulation and mitigation. I think this is a very hot topic globally amongst regulators, corporates, investors. And so we hopefully will kind of bring the discussion and put the lens in terms of what Hong Kong is doing in order to kind of support the industry in this matter. So just a bit of housekeeping before we start. This event is actually being broadcasted live. For those who are online, please do submit your questions in the Q&A, and we'll look to answer those by the moderator at the end of the session. And for those in person, there will be a microphone that will be circulated to you. For those who need to claim the SFC CPT points, please complete the survey at the end of this session, and then we will send the certificates to you. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session, Mr. Ben McQuhae, who is the founder of the prestigious Ben McQuhae & Co., the first ESG law firm. And he is also the Vice President and Special Advisor to HKGFA, amongst his many other titles. And so without further ado, Ben.
I have a.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Jenny, thank you very much. Can I just do a testing, greenwashing 1, 2? Is it coming through all right? Okay. Yes, you're all very welcome here to the live audience in Hong Kong, and of course the thousands who are tuning in worldwide. Greenwashing. Today we're going to be talking about risk, regulation and mitigation, really what you need to know. We're very lucky to have a really exciting panel to share their thoughts and wisdom with us. We also have a slightly different format, to our normal events. And so we're going to begin actually with a presentation from Dr. Daniel Cash, who will help us contextualize greenwashing, provide some definition and perspectives about what drives it, why it's a problem that we all need to work together to tackle, and of course the very important role that regulation and regulators will have in that outcome. By way of brief introduction, Daniel is a senior lecturer in law at Aston Law School in the UK. He's the founder of the Credit Rating Research Initiative and the founder of the very newly formed Greenwashing Research Project. So good morning, Daniel, and hopefully you can hear.
Good morning, Ben. I can hear you fine.
Great. So Daniel, if you're ready, the microphone and the screen are yours.
Thank you, Ben. So I just wanted to maybe give a brief context to the event, and it's based on a report that we collaboratively put together, you, myself, Paul Clement Hunt and Paul Watchman, and we did this report to submit to the European supervisory agencies who were seeking comment and analysis on things and different approaches they can take as regulators in combating greenwashing. So today what I'll do is maybe just provide some brief context to greenwashing, talk about some of those drivers that really sit beneath the increase in greenwashing, and then talk about some of the regulatory areas of focus that potentially different regulators may want to focus on. So one of the biggest things to understand about greenwashing is that it's a very complex, multidimensional, but also multidisciplinary problem. So whereas other problems may focus on disclosure or they may focus on different regulatory patterns, greenwashing really pervades across a wide area of different issues that regulators need to be considerate of. So that could be competition and competition law. It could be in the areas of disclosure. One of the key aspects of greenwashing issues at the moment is with advertising, not unsurprisingly. But also there's different elements in terms of like intellectual property, trademarking, and as you can see, there are a wide variety of different issues that one needs to be considerate of, which makes the pressure and the problem even more intense for regulators as they seek to get a handle on greenwashing and related issues. So if the slides could move forward, please. One of the biggest issues with greenwashing is that it's very difficult and there's not one real definition of what greenwashing is. So greenwashing is a relatively new idea in terms of it's been developed since the mid-80s. And the traditional understanding of greenwashing and a definition is, as you can see here on the screen, the intersection of two fair behaviours, both poor environmental performance and the positive communication about environmental performance. So in a sense, it's a case of doing one thing but saying another. But the problem is, as things have developed and things move on, it becomes a question of focus on terms of, are there other aspects that we could essentially categorize as greenwashing? So as is the rise with ESG, with social and governance aspects, the question then becomes, do social and governance aspects also become part of a greenwashing approach the regulators need to consider? I would argue that they do, but that also makes it more difficult for regulators as they move away from just looking at environmental claims to looking at social claims and governance claims. This really moves forward into an issue that is extremely difficult for regulators to consider, which is the concept of motive. How do you know that a company is intending to greenwash, or whether they're doing it by accident, or whether it's a misunderstanding of the rules and regulations and the procedures? It's very difficult to understand that. So regulators have difficulty at the moment in defining the levels of motive and consciousness, and then applying proportional regulations and penalties to deter that type of behavior. So as you can see, if you have definitional problems, you're at the starting point of solving that problem, and that's where we currently are with greenwashing. And whilst different regions, which we'll talk about later, are at different stages of battling greenwashing, the vast majority are still at this definitional stage, which shows just how far we need to go. If you could move the slides forward, please. So the issue here is essentially, if we think about what constitutes greenwashing, and there are two main types, although there are others. So in terms of claim greenwashing, it's all about the claim you make and then how you do that. So you could have something which is called selective disclosure, where you essentially only disclose information that gets to a certain outcome. So you may only disclose things that are positive about your company's operations. But there are also things called decoupling, where you have symbolic actions that you then emphasize, or you introduce and put it at the start or at the beginning of any interaction you have with your consumers. Examples may be planting trees in different parts of the world, or investing in certain green products, when the consumer also needs to know that the company is also investing in, let's say, fossil fuel or some of the so-called sin products. There is also executional greenwashing, and this is more nuanced. That could be, for example, well, if we look at this presentation that I'm giving you today, that's probably a very benign version of executional greenwashing. As you can see, the slides are green, the writing is green, and that's to constitute the element that we're looking at today, which is greenwashing and environmentalism. But if a company does it, let's say, for example, in their reports, they use green images, environmental-based images, that is a very slight but subtle way of executional greenwashing. Interestingly, research shows that this only really works on non-expert consumers, so regulators and sophisticated investors are not usually taken in by executional greenwashing. But that's a very important aspect that regulators need to consider when it comes to consumer protection. And when you look at things like the impact that labeling has on consumer habits, executional greenwashing is vitally important and a critical element in the battle against greenwashing. This is a real issue in terms of the foundational conceptual aspects of greenwashing, is that communication is at the core of everything that is greenwashing. That sounds unsurprising, but if you consider that communication lies at the heart of greenwashing, it shows you the length and scale and breadth of the problem, which shows you then as a regulator how difficult it is to get a grasp on the concept of greenwashing, because it's so large, multidimensional and multidisciplinary. So if you could move the slides forward, please. This comes to then what the European supervisory authorities were asking, and one of their main questions were what drives greenwashing. They're trying to look at certain specific pinch points that they can focus on as regulators to battle greenwashing. Our research report identified quite a few, but a few of the main ones were competitive pressures. And we found that companies are often incentivized to look kindly on competitive leaders, and then the issue comes for those different firms. So they're usually separated between green firms who do well and brown firms who do not. The question then becomes, how do those brown firms become green firms? And the question is, do they have the right strategies in place to do that? Some brown firms, researchers found, have decided to try to take shortcuts to become green firms whilst not taking the appropriate and necessary stages and steps to truly become a green firm. And that is usually revealing a lot of greenwashing to take those shortcuts. There's also the question of managerial incentives and remuneration policies. And this concept is really focused on the concept of time horizons. So in terms of different usual traditional corporate incentives, they're usually short-term in nature. And we remember the financial crisis, that was all revolving around the short-termism within the financial centres. What environmental and sustainable practice really pushes for is looking at the mid to long-term approaches. But this is where there is a contrast between the policies of companies that are greenwashing, in that they're saying and trying to develop different things, but their managerial incentives are still focused on the short-term success of the company. Whereas when you have environmental and sustainable successes, they're realized in the mid to long term. There is also social pressure which drives greenwashing, which can be linked to competitive pressure. So companies are told and are well aware that in the modern era, companies that are more sustainable and that more environmentally concerned are actually doing better in the long run. And that brings a social pressure, especially in terms of different campaigns from campaigners and civil society groups, to do better quickly, whereas some companies either take shortcuts knowingly or make mistakes in trying to catch up. And that also is a cause of greenwashing. And perhaps more appropriately for today's audience, one of the biggest areas is the regulation. In terms of a driver for greenwashing, regulation can be two sides of the very same coin, in terms of it can really drive anti-greenwashing practices, it can drive best practice, but the pressure that it exerts on companies can really cause greenwashing to become invasive, because either you maintain what you're doing and suffer, or you try to appear to be catching up with the regulatory push. And if you aren't doing it really thoroughly or extensively or for the right reasons, the chances are greenwashing will result, because you're not keeping up with the intention and the spirit of regulation that's focused on greenwashing. So in terms of areas of potential focus for regulators, they are different, and they are different by culture and community, but there are some that transfer across different communities, and the biggest issue, I believe, is one of deterrence. There have been a number of voluntary guidelines and codes of conduct in terms of preventing greenwashing, and regrettably, they're not working. If they're not working, the question then becomes, in terms of regulation, how do you deter? But then what becomes reasonable and what becomes practicable as a regulator to having your arsenal, and is it proportionate? These questions then turn into, is it reasonable, and can you induce positive behavior with your regulation? Because you stand a risk, if you perhaps go too extreme, that you will create more greenwashing because companies are forced to keep up with your new extent of regulation. So it's a very delicate balance and a difficult job facing regulators in the modern era. The other difficulty is, whereas if you are looking at, let's say, competitive issues, you would focus on your competitional regulators. The multifaceted nature of greenwashing and the multidisciplinary nature in terms of tackling it fundamentally means you have to have a multidisciplinary and multifaceted regulatory framework where there is also a centralized understanding of strategies and different targets and different trajectories to take. That's extremely difficult for a lot of different jurisdictions, especially when you have other aspects, which I will talk about perhaps at the end of the session today, which is the very difficult balance that countries are finding in combating greenwashing, but also trying to induce and be pro-business. And we're seeing this across different jurisdictions. In the UK, we're seeing different issues in terms of being a post-Brexit society, trying to be pro-business, but you also then have issues where large companies who are beneficial for the economy are greenwashing. The question is then, do you sanction them and potentially lose that business? How do you navigate that relationship, which is key? And that's happening in Canada, in the US, in the EU, in Australia at the moment. It's happening all over the world. A question here I have is greenwashing an advertising problem or something closer to the heart of corporate governance? Advertising at the moment is being very focal in terms of different things. So in the UK, the Advertising Standards Authority is being very, very on forefront of tackling greenwashing adverts from areas like aviation and fashion. But then the question comes is, those adverts and that development and those strategies are based within companies that should have better corporate governance systems to prevent that from happening. And then when we look at issues of like company law and corporate governance regulation, greenwashing isn't as strong there, which perhaps means that regulation is looking too far down the line, when in fact, if they looked closer to the start of the problem, they would solve issues further down the process. So there are other questions that I've posed for you there. I'll leave those on the screen. But to conclude, there are a number of issues facing regulators in the modern day. And I think what is needed is almost some empathy for regulators in terms of the task that they're faced with, and maybe looking at how to generate a multi-dimensional framework that aids regulators in this difficult task. So as you can see at the end, I say how to generate a sustainable framework is maybe to encourage journalists, investigative journalists, researchers, civil society groups and campaigners are proving to be really critical in the concept of accusing, which is vital for greenwashing development. So I'll give you a quick example. In the UK and further afield, there is a company called Client Earth that actually takes companies to court and almost acts in the interest as a lawyer for the climate, the environment, and the planet. So they've recently taken shelter court in terms of some of their greenwashing disclosures. I think those types of things, not just looking at Client Earth, but others, really need to be encouraged, supported, funded, given the necessary frameworks to do better, because a purely governmental interjection potentially and arguably isn't enough. But there is a massive role for the government and for regulators in combating greenwashing. So, Ben, I will leave it there, and thank you.
Daniel, thank you. You can see me emerging back on screen. It's I'm the virtual bailiff. Daniel, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. On stage, we're about to just, I think, realign the furniture so that I can invite the live participants on stage. But whilst we're doing that, and please feel free to come and start moving furniture around. Whilst we're doing that, Daniel, let me come back to you with at least, let me try and summarize a little bit of that. Then I have a sort of a brief follow-on question, if I may. So the first takeaway is that, you know, greenwashing is multidisciplinary, multidimensional and evolving problem that takes various forms. And those forms can be broadly categorized as claim greenwashing and executional greenwashing. The second takeaway for me is that greenwashing can manifest itself in many places, and perhaps the highest risk of greenwashing sort of presents itself in sort of financial services, the marketing of financial products, in advertising, in and also in the marketing of non-financial products. The third takeaway was that, you know, we need reasonable and practical regulation that sort of matches the multifaceted, multidimensional nature of greenwashing. Okay, so with all that said, I think now's a great time to invite Calvin, Grace, and Winnie on stage, please. Well, I think Calvin, Grace, and Winnie. I think it's conventional to sit under your name. Oh, that's very good. Okay. So let me just make some brief introductions. At the far end of the stage, well, Winnie Tam, who is Senior Manager, Intermediaries Supervision, Intermediaries at the Hong Kong SFC. Thank you, Winnie, for being with us. Next to Winnie is Grace. Grace is, Grace Wong. Grace is Senior Manager, Market Development Division, External Department at HKMA. Great to have you, Grace. And next to me in the hot seat, the heckler's chair, Calvin Kwan, Dr. Calvin Kwan, Director of Sustainability and Risk Governance at Link Asset Management. Thank you, Calvin. So 2 regulators, 2 PhDs. I'm pretty excited about this conversation. Niels got us going. And actually, I'd like to start with a bit of audience participation, if I may. There's no such thing as a seminar after all. So what I'd like to do with the live audience here in Hong Kong, just on a show of hands, if you would, and just indulge me, please raise your hand if you think there is no greenwashing in Hong Kong. Let me repeat that. Please raise your hand if you think there is no greenwashing in Hong Kong. Okay. For the benefit of our online audience, and it may come as no surprise, but not a single hand was raised, although I don't have my glasses on. So not a single hand was raised. So Winnie, Grace, Calvin, does that surprise you? Was that pretty much what you'd expect?
Well, as a regulator, I certainly hope there isn't any, but yeah, I'll see. Grace.
Yeah,
Same. No surprise.
No surprises. I think, it's the first, it really is the evolvement of, the green and sustainable finance space. So as with any market, there's got to be some kinks you have to work out.
Sure. Calvin, same.
Well, clearly, definitely no surprise, but I think it's more from the standpoint that we really don't know how to define greenwashing, right? So there's been a lot of instances recently about some organizations claiming being sued for greenwashing, and you stand back and go, wait a minute, that doesn't quite make sense. The other point ended up being it's about intentional greenwashing. I actually don't feel that I don't feel that there's a large instance of intentional greenwashing here in Hong Kong, right? Based on the companies that we have here. And the fear, however, is going to be the unintentional greenwashing. One example I can talk about, and it's not Hong Kong, but an airline. One of the European airlines, they had an advertisement campaign talking about make your flight more environmentally friendly, okay, by buying carbon credits. And I think that there was no intention, in my opinion, there's no intention to do greenwashing there. But the advertising authority felt that that was greenwashing simply because when, buying a carbon offset does not necessarily, it does not reduce the emissions coming from your airplane, right? So you still have the emissions, so it's still producing the particles. And I think the key word that they tied into there was, cleaning up your environmental footprint, which is impossible in that standpoint, right? And I don't think that that's intentional, but I also feel that that's kind of a gray area for greenwashing.
Sure.
So I think it's similar in Hong Kong, where I'm not surprised no one's raised their hands, but I think it's more because of the fear. You know what? Did I unintentionally do greenwashing?
Sure, thank you. Whilst you have the microphone sort of warmed up, the majority of the speakers today, we have regulators, academics, or professional services. So in the greenwashing context, we're the finger pointers. But you, Calvin, you bring a very different and actually quite unique perspective, because you represent, a listed company and a regulated entity, and so it's you that has to sort of identify and manage risk. And so let me ask you, if I may, to what extent is greenwashing a real risk to Link, and how do you go about mitigating that?
Real risk. I think if you asked me this question a month ago, my answer would be not a lot of risk, primarily because we're in Hong Kong, but maybe more than a month, 2 months ago. But recently, we're seeing a lot of focus from European investors looking at how do they deal with this, from SFDR being mandatory now. So what we're seeing is that a lot of investors will be asking us about greenwashing. They'll be asking us more details about our net zero strategy. So we announced a strategy to achieve net zero by 2035. In the past, it was, oh, great, we're happy, checkbox, not a problem. But what we're now noticing is that investors are asking, okay, we need a little bit more detail. Tell me how you're going to get it done, to demonstrate that it's not just me saying that we'll do net zero by 2035. Some of you have heard me say this before. There's a possible chance I'll still be at Link at 2035 and see this through, right? And from that standpoint, it's a matter of European investors are asking this question. We haven't had so much from Hong Kong at this moment, so it wasn't really that key risk there. But I do see that this is going to increase. We also have American investors, and you've seen where SEC is going with this as well. I mean, they've put together a climate task force to essentially operate as if their climate reporting regulations are already in effect, right? So it's still being reviewed. It's, from what I hear now, it's being toned down a little bit, but that climate task force of SEC is already operating as if these recommendations are in effect. So for Link, because we are 100% free flow, European and American investors, we have to deal with this right away. And I guess one way of mitigating the risk or escalating it, most recently, it's actually, we follow a little bit of recommendations for both SFC and also Hong Kong Stock Exchange, where we've said specifically that climate-related issues and ESG are a board responsibility. Okay, so from that, and what we've actually done is streamline the ESG indicators that we have. So long story short, I report roughly 150 ESG indicators. And the reason for this is because of the various benchmarks, GRESB, CDP, GRI, and so forth. But of those 150, the board looks at me and says, there's no way we have the expertise to look at all these issues. And we're going to, we have to make sure that we have oversight on these issues. And what we've done there is actually reduce it down to 33 KPIs. And these are the ones that these are the environmental social indicators that are material to our business, right? And then from those 33, that's what the the management team will review and have oversight over. For the board, we've reduced it even further. We've taken the material issues, and then we've looked at those ones that have the ability to affect our enterprise value. Okay, so now we have ESG indicators that are material and have the ability or potential to affect our enterprise value. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's coming from ISSB. Now, I've taken it another 2 steps further. Not only is it about enterprise value, but it's also the ability, the potential for this to affect our reputation as well. So that's the social component. So, and the last criteria that I've added in is to any indicator that will help us monitor and assess potential for greenwashing. Okay, so this has meant that I've taken 150 indicators, condensed it down to roughly 10, and we're still finalizing that right now, 10 indicators that affect my enterprise value, have the potential to affect enterprise value, has a potential to affect the relationships that we have with our key stakeholders, and lastly, has the potential to monitor for greenwashing.
Okay, I'm going to jump in there. So I'm just flicking through the questions that we received, and we're receiving a lot of questions. Thank you very much, and keep them coming. A lot of them are about what's happening in other jurisdictions, what sort of international best practices, and there's a lot of questions around, what are some of the sort of the juicy, gory greenwashing, regulatory enforcement actions, litigations, etc. And we'll try to come onto those in the sort of the last section and try and deal with it all in one go. But one of the takeaways I glean from your remarks is that, internally, of course, you're very well organized and sort of ahead of the sort of sustainability curve. But whilst you're a sort of Hong Kong listed and regulated entity, then sort of emerging regulations, in this case, in respect of greenwashing in other jurisdictions that are relevant to your business, do also inform your so it's decision making and risk mitigation. Okay, good. Thank you. Let's just sort of switch gears slightly and bring in our regulators. I feel like we're so far away, but we have Daniel in between us. In November last year, HKMA published a research memorandum titled "Greenwashing in the Corporate Green Bonds Market." We have Grace here today. So Grace, please, if you would share with us what you can about the research exercise and your key findings.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. So as Ben mentioned, our research colleagues from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority issued a research memorandum last year. So the paper is really an academic paper trying to look at the area of greenwashing in corporate green bond markets, because there hasn't been a lot of empirical analysis on this. And of course, given that it's an empirical analysis, there aren't a lot of nuances, which, Daniel mentioned earlier, the intention behind greenwashing. So none of those nuances, but pure empirical analysis. So there are sort of 3 key findings from the paper. The first one is, as you expect, greenwashing is really not uncommon in the corporate green bond market. This is the global corporate green bond market, though. So the paper shows that around 1/3 of green bond issuers have actually had a poorer environmental performance after the issuance of their green bond. So of course, again, whether it's intentional or not intentional, we don't have any insight into that, but that's the empirical findings. The second key finding was that, to a certain extent, on the flip side of the coin, the market has been able to penalize this kind of greenwashing. First, in that greenwashing issuers are less likely to issue green bonds again. And even if they do issue green bonds again, they encounter a higher issuance cost. And this makes intuitive sense. If the investors are able to distinguish between environmental performance, then for those greenwashing firms, the demand for those bonds would be lower, and hence, they wouldn't be able to issue, or they'd have to issue at a higher cost. And then the third kind of key finding from the paper is more from the regulatory's perspective. And it really does, contribute to, it aligns with global discourse on that, in that taxonomy, having a taxonomy in place and having higher, greater disclosure requirements in place will help to mitigate greenwashing. So again, having, clear standards will allow investors to more easily distinguish between what are green projects. So, those are the key findings from the research paper. And, it makes a lot of intuitive sense, but I think what really adds to the conversation is that it's, there's very few empirical research on this area. So,
Okay, thank you. And the research memorandum is available on HKMA website.
Yeah.
I must be, because I've seen it.
Yeah.
And I've read it. It's actually very interesting. I found it quite interesting, the research parameters, because they look at, or the researchers really made their assessment based on the sort of pre and post issuance GHG emissions of the issuer. I mean, quite a lot of the sort of critique we see and hear about in relation to green bonds and sustainable linked loans, et cetera, tend to target the sort of use of proceeds and the sort of apparently inadequacy of sort of follow-up and checking, et cetera. So it's a very different perspective, which I think is interesting and definitely worth a read. Grace, I know that HKMA are sort of active in other initiatives. You've got the cross-agency steering group, for example, and then there's the green bond, the subsidy grant scheme. Can you share a little bit with us about that and how possibly those initiatives are going, or at least contributing to our efforts to I suppose, understand, identify, and hopefully tackle greenwashing?
Yeah, definitely. I think, from my perspective at the cross-agency steering group, we've been working on sort of 3 key areas, which would help to address this area of, greenwashing. First is taxonomy, which the paper from our research colleagues mentioned, having a clear taxonomy in place will help to mitigate greenwashing. So here in Hong Kong, the cross-agency steering group, SFC, HKMA, the regulators, the financial regulators, so the HKMA is leading the initiative to set up a green classification framework. Really, the aim is to try and increase transparency in the financial market and to enable consistent policy making. So here we're guided by 3 principles: interoperability, comparability, and transparency. So I think it's quite a mouthful, but what it really means is that we're trying to enable sort of easy comparison, easy navigation amongst the common ground taxonomy, China's taxonomy, and the EU taxonomy, because really those are sort of the most established taxonomies globally. And in addition to that, we try to take into account local considerations. So especially here in Hong Kong, being an international financial center, we have, a host of international financial firms here. So while we want to enhance transparency, we also don't want to add to their burden and the cost. Calvin mentioned earlier, as a firm, they also have to look at the different regulations across different markets. So here, by trying to navigate amongst these, aligning with these international and industry standards, we hope to lower the costs for, to enable comparability, while at the same time lowering costs, lowering hurdles for the market to adopt this taxonomy. So that's sort of the first initiative that we're working on, taxonomy. Second is on disclosure. And, we have Winnie from the FC here, so she can talk a little bit more about that, whether it's from the issuer's perspective, TCFD, ISSB, or from the product level. And I think the third key area that we're really working on is support for the industry, because it's all good and nice, to have all these regulations, taxonomy, everything in place. But we do know that it's, hard for the industry. It isn't something that everybody can do straight away. They need time, they need ability, they need data. So, in terms of support for industry, I think just want to mention 2 quick examples. First is the grant scheme that, Ben mentioned earlier. So, for just to take example of sustainable bonds, I think a lot of sustainable bonds, it's very common to have a pre-issuance external review. And we really want to try and encourage issuers to motivate them to extend the external review to after post issuance. So for the GSF grant scheme that the government has, we actually provide subsidies for issuers, which enables sort of the end-to-end external review of a bond, whether it's from post-issuance sort of framework external review to pre-issuance framework external review to post-issuance. So reporting, disclosure, and external review. So we hope that through some sort of financial incentives, this decreases some of the frictions for issuers to do more disclosure.
But does it also recognizing or reflecting on the sort of the conclusion research work that up to 30% of issuers are, these are my words, potentially greenwashers? Does the management of the sort of subsidy scheme provide HKMA potentially an opportunity to help avoid future greenwashing at that early stage because of the conditions that you could potentially attach to the grant award?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think our aim here really is to try to encourage and motivate issuers. And, obviously one of the key hurdles for them is in the motivation is that, there is an added financial cost. So if we can help to take away some of this financial cost, at least that will no longer be a hurdle for them. And we hope that through this, smoothing, it will help on facilitating greater disclosure post-issuance. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, sorry, just
Please.
one very quick last point is I think, the HKMA did a greenest assessment amongst banks back in 2020. And then one of the things that we covered was the bank's TCFD readiness. And while we did find around 40% of banks were making some sort of disclosure along the lines of some of the TCFD recommendations, there were some key challenges that they faced, which included, having this relevant data from their clients, as well as having the right people with the right skills to do this kind of analysis. So, to that extent, the cross-agency steering group has been working on sort of these hurdles in terms of data, talent, capacity building. And we really hope that through the support to the industry, it's not just all about the regulation, but also some support, give some support to the industry to help address this.
I'm glad you raised capacity building, and I don't want to get sort of sucked into a sort of a separate discussion on this, or too sucked in, because it's probably worthy of its own webinar. But in Hong Kong, like I'm sure every international financial center, capacity building in sort of areas of sustainability is a really high priority. There's just not enough talent yet. So that is I'm just going to say it's a fact for us, and it's for most financial centers. At the same time, of course, we want to address and eliminate as effectively as we can greenwashing from our financial system, and that requires talent. And of course, we're all competing for the same talent. Public sector and private sector, everyone's competing for the same talent. Anyone who's an ESG expert, you're in a great time in your life. But one of the issues that this concept, which I'm hearing about more and more, and that's competence washing or competence greenwashing. Idea that people are sort of, I don't know, airbrushing their CVs and bios and overstating their experience with a view to, being hireable or more employable. I don't know whether, perhaps, Daniel, you might have a couple of just quick words on competence washing and whether that's something that is a sort of a real issue and a real risk in Europe.
It is. It's a growing risk. I think there are researchers who know much more about it than I do, including, I would point everybody to the work of Kim Schumacher and some of the work that's going on there. But it's just another aspect of competence greenwashing, is another issue to deal with on top of the many other issues to deal with. So I think the research is very nascent in terms of the effect of greenwashing, but it seems to be a growing concern, particularly in Europe and in the US. But I think in Europe, they're starting to focus on it much more.
Okay. Did you
Just
please?
just to supplement on that point, I mean, we are aware of this kind of, this lack of talent or competition for talent. And what you mentioned about the, competency greenwashing. So from the HKMA's perspective, we're also working on an enhanced competency framework for banking practitioners in the field of green and sustainable finance. And I think that the aim would really be to address, some of the issues that you mentioned. I think firstly, it's really to make sure that, the banking practitioners in Hong Kong have the skills that they need in order to do work in this area. And this isn't just about ESG specialists, because you need this kind of talent across the whole of the banking industry, whether you're, actually investment specialists, whether you are, the RM, you might have to explain it to your clients. So everyone from the front end to the back end across the whole spectrum, they need a certain level of, ESG knowledge. And so that's where the enhanced competency framework comes in.
Thank you.
I actually just want to add on that. Last year, I think Grace is aware of this already. We also launched the cross-agency steering group. We launched the capacity building support scheme, and in that scheme, actually, we have a list of eligible programs that actually went through vetting process. So in terms of the capacity greenwashing, hopefully that will also help minimize a little bit on that concern.
Great.
As well.
Okay. Well, this is perfect because it's your turn, Winnie. And I think for many, certainly in financial center economies like ours in Hong Kong, greenwashing in financial markets is the sort of, or perhaps presents the greatest risk, and therefore is the sort of the greatest problem area. And as the poll suggests, the perception here is that we do live, greenwashing is alive and well in Hong Kong, and I think we would all accept that. So could you please share with us SFC's initiatives relevant to greenwashing, and perhaps equally importantly, where you see the direction of regulatory travel heading in this area?
Sure.
Please.
So in terms of greenwashing, just want to highlight, actually back in 2018, in the SFC strategic framework for sustainable finance, we actually already recognized that greenwashing definitely is one of the challenge when it comes to sustainable investment. Similar to what all the speakers have mentioned. So, for example, the world would be asset managers might be promoting or marketing themselves as green or sustainable, but in reality, in practice, they actually haven't integrated these factors into their investment process. And this ultimately potentially might affect how investors' confidence in sustainable investment, and also threatens our efforts in, for example, combating greenwashing. Combating climate change, excuse me. So from the SFC side, what we did is we issue a couple of circulars, and also we amended our fund manager code of conduct to set out clear regulatory expectations, first of all, to our fund managers on the management and disclosures of climate-related risk. And secondly, to our managing companies that are managing SFC authorized funds with a ESG focus and have reflect these focus in their investment, in the fund's investment objectives or strategies, which I'll refer to as ESG funds. And I just want to briefly elaborate a bit on these requirements. So first of all, in terms of the requirements to the fund manager, firstly, that requirement is mandatory to the fund managers. And it's regardless of whether they're managing SFC authorized funds or it's non-SFC authorized funds, and also regardless whether those funds are having a ESG focus or not. And depending on whether climate-related risk is assessed to be relevant and material, and also depending on the size of the asset under manage, and also depending whether the fund manager is responsible for the overall operations of the fund. So considering all these factors, the in-scope fund managers will need to incorporate climate-related risk into their governance, investment management, and risk management process, and also to make appropriate disclosures accordingly. And obviously, the objective of this mandatory requirement is to, first of all, ensure fund managers will take climate-related risk, which is recognized as a source of financial risk, into considerations. And also, secondly, to ensure there will be clear, comparable, and high-quality information disclose to the investors and to help them to make informed investment decisions. And just one more thing to highlight on that is to minimize the compliance burden, we also make, when we're setting out the requirement, we make reference to TCFD to make sure that, because that is a globally recognized disclosure recommendations. So these mandatory requirements to fund managers actually already became effective as of November last year. So at this point in time, the SFC, we are in the process of performing review and assessments to see how our in-scope fund managers are implementing these new requirements through our routine on-site inspections. And in parallel, through these inspections, we are also assessing if there are any potential greenwashing concerns that are similar to the ones that are being highlighted in other jurisdictions, which I believe we'll talk about it a bit further later on. So that's on the fund manager side, and on the managing companies of ESG funds. So back in 2019, the SFC actually already issued a circular to lay out disclosure expectations on ESG funds. But considering the increase in the number of ESG funds in the market and also the changes in the regulatory development in this area. So in June 2021, we actually issued another circular superseding the one in 2019, adding on additional disclosure expectations on ESG funds. For example, how the ESG funds, the ESG focus should be measured and monitored, and also the periodic assessments, and also reporting on the funds, how has been attained to the ESG focus and so on. And on top of that, we also, the SFC actually maintain a database that lists out all the SFC authorized ESG funds, which is available on the SFC website. And also to increase the transparency of these SFC authorized ESG funds, we include key features of these ESG funds, for example, whether their investment themes would be, let's say, is it climate change focus, or is it ESG or sustainable, and also the ESG, the investment strategy, whether it's positive screening or best in class and so on. So that's from the SFC side. So moving a little bit further to international level, to sort of mitigating greenwashing and also in response to all the investors' needs. So I believe we're all aware of the IFRS International Sustainability Standard Board, so the ISSB. They're in the process of developing a corporate disclosure standards to ensure there will be a sort of a consistent and also a global approach for the corporates to make disclosure in relation to sustainability related risks and opportunities to investors. I understand that at this point in time, the ISSB is aiming to publish the finalized standards by end of Q2 this year. So in light of that, the IOSCO, which is the International Organizations of Securities Commissions, they will perform an independent and detailed assessments of the finalized standards once it becomes available, to ensure that it's fit for purpose and also it meets the needs of the capital markets. And if the finalized standards of the ISSB, it meets the IOSCO expectation, IOSCO will endorse the standards and then encourage the IOSCO members to make reference to these finalized standards for when they're setting out their national level sustainability disclosures requirements. Another separate but related matter that I want to mention is to enhance the sustainability reporting and also to ensure there will be reliable information to the investors, it is also important to have an independent assurance framework in place so that we can sort of build trust around the sustainable reporting ecosystem and also to combat greenwashing. So in this regard, I understand that IOSCO is actually soon, they will publish their versions of a global assurance framework, including a list of recommendations that will be to standard setters and assurance providers and issuers on it. One last thing I want to mention is also related to IOSCO initiative on greenwashing is back in 2021 November, IOSCO Sustainable Finance Task Force, they published 2 reports. One is on asset managers and the other one is on ESG ratings and data providers, which sets out a list of recommendations and also good practices for regulators and market participants. And then in following these 2 reports, IOSCO actually also published a call for action just last year in November, encouraging voluntary standard setters and also industry associations to promote these good practices and also the IOSCO recommendations. The reason that IOSCO published the call for actions is to promote an international alignment and also to combat greenwashing. So just to highlight SFC's response to these call for actions and also the 2 reports. So in terms of asset manager, as I mentioned previously, we have been in the forefront in this area. We've amended our fund manager code of conduct. We set out mandatory requirements to our fund managers on climate-related risks. And then on the ESG data and products provider, we actually have been taking various steps. Just last year, we've performed a fact-finding exercise to understand the current operating model of ESG service providers, and also to understand the current practices of asset managers when they're engaging with these ESG service providers. And at this point in time, we are assessing all the information being gathered from the exercise, and then we'll determine what is the most appropriate approach for Hong Kong to take on in relations to ESG data and product providers going forward. So
okay, I'm going to jump in there.
Yeah.
Jenny, I'm working off that clock, by the way. Okay, thank you. Which says we've got 3 hours left. Okay, thank you. I mean, clearly, you know, there's a lot of tangible action. What I tend to do to get a sense of, you know, the direction of travel here, because you look at what SFC is saying in the various announcements and publications, and you know, people can look at the what's it called, the SFC's agenda for green and sustainable finance 2022. You look at what IOSCO is saying, and I think suffice to say, greenwashing looms large in all of those publications. And so, you know, I'm not going to try and put any of our regulators on the spot, but my crystal ball tells me that we should all be anticipating, you know, there's more regulation to support a more robust greenwashing, anti-greenwashing framework coming, okay? And we should be prepared for that. So I had a great question, which I have to ask you. I was going to ask you frankly, in a more subtle way. The question here says, will the SFC name and shame publicly? And you don't need to respond to that, because my question was going to be,
that's a fair question.
It is, and I understand you lead SFC's FMCC inspection team. So,
I'm one of the inspection team leads.
So, what can you tell us about the, I don't know, naming or shaming, or indeed SFC's approach to identifying and handling greenwashing behavior?
Let me put it this way. As I mentioned before, the FMCC new requirements just became effective as of November last year. So we are reviewing and assessing how our in-scope fund managers are adhering to their expectations. But I think my personal view is through these inspections, of course, we want to understand how they are doing, what kind of challenges or difficulties are they experiencing, and whether they are clearly understanding our regulatory expectations. And at the end of the day, I think it's very important to have a communications with, let's say, the portfolio managers and also other members of the licensed corporations to understand why they're doing what they're doing, or why they're not doing what they haven't done, before we actually jump into any conclusion. So I think that's personally, that's the approach that we are hoping to do. But of course, if as with any other SFC requirements, if there's any non-compliance issue that is triggering any potential fit and properness, then that's another topic to discuss.
Okay.
Hey, Winnie, let me just jump in. I'm not on that list, right? Just want to make sure.
I hope not.
I hope not too.
You are now.
I hope not. I certainly hope not.
That's terrific. Daniel, if I can just sort of loop you back in. In the ESA response that we worked on together, you know, we emphasized the importance of a sort of a robust enforcement regime. Can you just give us, if possible, just in a minute, you know, why is that such an important part of the, I suppose, the toolkit?
It's extremely important, but I mean, I think what Winnie was saying is absolutely right. It's a very delicate issue because you don't want to break down a regulatory relationship that you have with the regulated that will prevent communication in the future, that could maybe rechannel different approaches and prevent larger scale greenwashing. I think there has to be a deterrent, but I think there maybe has to be some consensus maybe on the threshold for applying that deterrent. And I think that's a multi-stakeholder discussion that regulators need to have about what's appropriate for their regulatory culture in their regulatory community. And it will probably be different in different jurisdictions because you have the public pressure, which is probably the basis of that question that was in the Q&A box in terms of naming and shaming. But you also have the realities of a business relationship that regulators need to consider, promote, engage, and encourage.
Okay, thank you. We've received so many questions. I'm not quite sure how to start trying to tackle them. And some I don't think, you know, this isn't the right forum because it would just take up too much time. But what I'd like to do is sort of circulate the questions, because some are directed, you know, to our speakers. So you could at least know the sorts of questions that are being asked. It's things like, you know, will energy guzzling virtual asset exchanges have to disclose their carbon footprint? If not, why not? Indeed, should all licensed corporations have to disclose their carbon footprint? If not, why not? Along a similar theme, why shouldn't all private companies above a certain size have to disclose? If not, why not? The naming and shaming we've covered. There's a lot of questions about, there's one about Trump. There are a lot of questions around, you know, regulation in other key markets. And I think this is the perfect time to maybe it's our sort of crescendo to start finishing up on. And Daniel, could I sort of pass the mic back to you to sort of lead us through this? We'll have to be quite quick, I'm afraid, but it's really the regulatory setup in Europe.
Yeah, so I think on the website, I've put a document together that will be available for everybody to read in terms of reviewing the major issues in different jurisdictions. But I think one of the issues where somebody asked in the chat about why is America so far behind was because of Trump. I think the answer is these are cultural, perhaps cultural issues in terms of how different jurisdictions tackle this problem. And let's say in America, it's very, traditionally, it's very pro-business, it's very anti-interventionist, and regulating greenwashing goes against maybe those two aspects. So that's maybe the answer to that question. In Europe, it's very different. They've taken, after the financial crisis, they really accelerated their approach of regulating across the board. And something that I wanted to quickly touch back on, when we talk about competency greenwashing, I think one of the issues is there needs to be a lot of focus on stopping those 4-week courses that universities are piping out where people get told they've learned ESG in 4 weeks. When in fact, what you're trying to instill is an understanding of a deep understanding of sustainability, which isn't ESG. It's very different. It's more broader and more holistic. In the European Union, they've tried to inject that focus on sustainability across the board. The breaking news is there's a leaked EU directive that's coming that gives companies 10 days to justify any green claims they make or face quote, effective, proportionate and dissuasive penalties. So one of the issues in Europe is now when you make a claim, you have to prove it immediately, and you also have to make that information very clear to the consumer or the end user and make it in close proximity so they don't have to be a specialist to learn about the background of your green claim. And that's happening in the UK as well. In the UK, the FCA is taking the lead on a post-Brexit approach but they're having challenges in developing their own version of the SFDR, but challenging that and balancing it against the needs of the UK economy as it reels from leaving the European Union and the pandemic. And we're seeing that across the board in places like Australia that are taking an increased approach in terms of the Securities and Investment Commission. They've recently had their first legal action against a pension fund. China recently said that its Securities Regulatory Commission plans to regulate green funds and rein in greenwashing. There's news expected in Q2 of this year. And Japan's Financial Services Authority are proposing new guidelines for public funds. But I think what's key to say is that each jurisdiction appears to be at different levels in their response to greenwashing, and they're trying to understand their cultural frameworks and parameters and constraints to provide the best answer for their community. So I think that's where we're up to so far.
Great, thanks for that. And just also very quickly, we received quite a few questions that want sort of more sort of information and details about some of the quite public, we might just say, greenwashing horror stories. Interestingly, I think most of our focus today has been in relation to sort of financial services, financial markets, but interestingly, quite a lot of those, I would say, greenwashing horror stories or embarrassments relate to sort of false advertising and our sort of actions under the Advertising Standards Authority and the, I forget the other one, the Marketing Authority. I'm not sure, actually, and maybe if anyone is sure, then please let us all know. But I'm not aware that we have a similar sort of advertising standards authorities in Hong Kong, and if we do, you know, quite what the rules and regs are. But can you share with us a little bit, Daniel, about the ASA and the CMA? And the time is blinking at me, so I'm afraid we really don't have much time.
The ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK, is trying to take the lead on pushing back against certain industries, key ones being aviation. So I think Calvin was talking earlier about the Lufthansa incident, where they've just been accused today of, with the different aspects of the green bonds that's developed, but they've also been stopped from different advertisements on their corporate reporting, where they've used the plane and the planet together in one image, which denotes different things. And they're also challenging against fashion, food labeling, and also electric vehicles and stuff like that. So I think in Britain, advertising and competition through the CMA is proving to be the pinnacle of our cultural response to greenwashing.
Thank you. Okay, I think, tempting as it is just to keep going, I'm keeping people from their Friday evenings and perhaps more importantly, the wine that's, I guess, at the back of the room. So let me just try and sort of wrap up. We must all assume that greenwashing is sort of as alive and kicking here as, frankly, any sort of international financial center. We've identified that there are many faces of greenwashing, and these are complex, multidisciplinary, multifaceted. And there are high risks. Okay, there are high risks for financial products and advertising, marketing, but also in the talent space. And greenwashing, we didn't really get so much into the sort of the risks and how the risks sort of manifest themselves, because there are so many different potential affected parties. But maybe that's a follow-on conversation that we can have. But important to say that, you know, greenwashing risk isn't just a risk for the, I guess, the perpetrator. You know, the bigger picture risk is, of course, that it undermines our collective efforts to decarbonize. And I would say that's the biggest risk, and that's why tackling greenwashing is such an important priority for all of us. Okay. And as always, coordination is going to be, and cooperation is going to be essential. So I think we have to adjourn our conversation here. I do have a feeling this will be the first of many. Let me thank our live audience and our virtual audience very much. And a huge thanks and a big round for our experts. So Winnie, Grace, Daniel, and Calvin, thank you very much.
Thank you.